So basically, in this century, the 1600s to 1700s, there's really two really competing political theories that are going to emerge and that we're going to talk about. The first of them is absolutism, and it's really going to dominate the vast majority of this time frame. And then towards the end of this time frame, once we get into the mid 1700s to late 1700s, we're going to have the rise of what's called constitutionalism, which should sound familiar because that's what we have. And so today we're going to look at the first one, absolutism. And while there are several monarchs in Europe that are going to be absolute monarchs, the one that we're going to focus on today is King Louis XIV of France. And you can actually see him here, seated. He looks like Jack Sparrow over here. Okay, that was high fashion of the time frame here. And so this is King Louis XIV. Well, absolute theory is based on the concept of the divine right of kings, and that's something you need to kind of remember. The divine right of kings basically means that kings get their authority directly from God, right? And so if we look at, parts of the Bible like Proverbs, and you have God speaking and talking about, or the fact that like God, ordained Saul and then David to be king, right? So they have this idea that by God, kings reign and princes, they decree justice. And so this seems to support the idea that kings get their authority straight from God. And they're not, getting it from an alternative source like the people, which is what we kind of think of now. And so this would mean that the king is only answerable to God alone. And this is kind of coming out of the medieval political theory, which we talked about quite a bit. And you may remember some of the discussions about, the rising of royal power in the High Middle Ages and some of those things. And the idea is that the kings have a lot of earthly power that God has given to them. And so during the Protestant Reformation, we see kings starting to really expand their power even further than they had during the medieval period. King like Henry VIII of England, he not only became the head of state, but he was also the head of the English church, right? So that's really going to make him have even more power. And the fact that he's the head of the church also means that he is closer to God than everyone else. So that kind of was used to solidify this divine right of kings. So it's growing from those earlier concepts. Probably the best definition that we can use in our class for absolutism is the idea that the ruler is the source of all political authority, and that this has the implication that the king is actually above the law. So if he has rule over a political authority, that means he is above the law himself, which, again, is in stark contrast to what we kind of see our justice system today. Again, he answers to God alone, and there is no representative institution, no constitution at all that can check or limit his authority. So this is going to have a big impact on countries that are going to adopt this absolutist theory into their government system. And you can really see from this graphic here that this is kind of how absolute rulers are going to rule. Okay, absolute ruler is going to limit or control the power of the nobles. The absolute ruler is going to make laws, and he's also going to dispense justice. The ruler is going to rule on their own, okay? They're not going to use representative assemblies in any way to help him or her. If he does have a representative assembly, it's basically just, he expects them to just rubber stamp whatever he wants. He brings them a law and says, hey, this is the law. And he expects that representative assembly to go, yep, that's the law. We said so, right? He basically, he's going to control the religious authorities. He's going to control the church within his kingdom. And he's going to use the army to expand his borders and, of course, keep everything under his control using the army as well. So he's kind of in control of the military as well. Again, the key points to take away here is that the absolutist theory idea is that all political authority belongs to the king or the ruler. Now, some examples of monarchs in many European countries in the 17th and 18th centuries, like Russia and Austria and Spain, but again, we're going to focus on France and King Louis XIV. Louis XIV is kind of held up as the premier example of an absolute monarch, and we're going to kind of look at how he expanded his power and became such a strong absolute monarch, but we're going to first focus specifically on politics. So Louis XIV becomes king in 1643 at the age of 5. Yeah. So his dad died. Louis XIII dies. He's 5 years old. So he's going to become king at 5. Obviously, he can't run a country at 5. So a regency is going to be put in place that is headed by his mother, Queen Anne. And she's going to appoint government ministers. And one of the major government ministers that she appoints is a clergyman called Cardinal Mazarin. And together, Queen Anne and Cardinal Mazarin are going to help ensure that Louis has a successful reign. And they actually lay the foundations of that reign for him to become such an absolutist monarch. We see King Louis is going to take his first steps into majorly becoming a monarch in 1661. That's when Cardinal Mazarin dies. It's at this point that Louis is going to make a declaration that he will no longer have a prime minister. So he's basically saying, hey, I no longer need somebody to help me rule this country. I'm in charge now. So there's no second in command to carry out his will. Louis will rule on his own, and we really start to see how that statement of absolutism is going to take effect. He's going to be taking political power into himself. And in fact, there's a famous phrase that he's alleged to have said in French that is basically, I am the state. I am the state. Somebody asked him, well, who's in charge of this country? He says, I am the country. Me. I'm the government. Me. Everything. And that's pretty telling. He's not going to be interested in sharing power at all. Instead, he becomes the government. He's not going to rely on any ministers to do anything. He is at the very tip top of the government. Now, the major challenge to Louis's power is the nobility. Because since the Middle Ages, the nobility have had a great deal of power at the local level. Maybe not at the national level, right? But at the local level, each noble kind of ruled over their own territory, right? And Louis doesn't want that. He wants to limit their power, and we're going to talk about how he does that in just a second. But one of the ways that he's not only going to limit the power of the nobility, but also the power of the people in general, is that he decides not to no longer call meetings of what's known as the Estates General during his reign. And the Estates General, it's kind of like Parliament or Congress, right? Where representatives, nobility would come together and they would kind of, talk about and discuss laws. He says, yeah, as long as I'm king, y'all don't need to meet anymore because nothing y'all say is important. Clearly, this guy understands who the boss is, right? And so all these people would come together, but he said, we're not going to call that anymore. And he's starting to say, once again, I'm the state. I make all the decisions. He also creates a system of intendants, and it's really created before him, but he really institutes it, I guess. And these government officials are appointed by King Louis to go out into the countryside, so the areas surrounding Paris, and they're going to help the king implement his decrees, and when it comes to matters such as justice and policing and finances. So they're really kind of the king's eyes and ears outside of his capital city. They're kind of like the secret police kind of thing. Only they weren't really secret. They'd ride into town and everybody would be like, oh, shoot, they're here. We better make sure that we've been doing everything right and that all of our taxes are paid or we're in trouble, right? Most of the time, though, what's really weird is that before King Louis, who do you think was carrying out the job of making sure all the policies and taxes were collected? The prime minister and the nobility, right? But he just got rid of all them, and he's trying to take power from the nobility. So he created his own group to go and do this, which is just a slap in the face to the nobility, really. He also puts in place his own judicial system, some powers like tax collection. Louis is taking these powers away from the nobility and placing them in the hands of the attendants. And those are the people he appoints. And of course, they're going to be loyal to him. At least this time, Louis is kind of creating an image of himself that, is going to be, very powerful, and he really is constructing a persona of what a king of France should be. He projects himself as the Sun King, and we can see this a lot in a lot of artwork. You look at the paintings that we have here. Louis is being presented in this image as the god Apollo or the sun god. So he literally, I mean, if you look at this, he's literally like saying, I am the sun god. Because the sun rises with me and sets with me, right? It kind of looks like a ballet costume, but, either way. So through concentrating power into his own person, limiting the nobles' powers, never calling, the estates general, these systems of intendants to exercise his power in the countryside, these are all ways that he was securing political control and becoming an absolute monarch. We can also see examples of Louis's absolutism when we look at culture. So the primary style, artistic style of the period is known as Baroque, okay? And you do need to know about Baroque. And of course, you have the old joke. It's one of my favorite corny dad jokes of history is that, if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. Yeah. Anyways, the Baroque is very highly ornate kind of style for the time period. And you see it all over Europe. And we just kind of point out to you in the artwork, Louis is using some of that ornate style of art to project his power to the people. And he's using art to do this. He's using theater to do it. Playwrights are going to write plays that kind of enhance the king's image. I showed you, a picture of Louis in kind of a ballet costume. Dance becomes a way that Louis is going to maintain his power and use of the ballet. Of course, it doesn't, today we don't think maybe like fancy ballerinas are, the political power of the day today. But in a way, it's one of the ways that Louis is going to work to control his nobility because making a ballet is very difficult and it's ornate and it's beautiful. And so he starts to say, hey, this Baroque style is pretty and beautiful. I'm pretty and beautiful. Baroque's the only way we should build things. I'm the only way a king should be built. You see how he kind of connects the two styles. You also have the construction of the Palace of Versailles. So if you look at the two images that we have here of Versailles, we have Versailles circa 1630, 1640. It is basically a royal hunting lodge. Yeah, this house over here is a hunting lodge for the royals. Now that might be a little bit bigger than some of your hunting camps, right? A little bit more vast than your hunting camps that you might have. But he is simply going to start undertaking a massive construction campaign to turn this hunting lodge into a very big palace complex. And so by 1668, you can now see that it is a very sprawling palace, and it's difficult to see this picture in the light. On the slideshow, you can see it better, but it ends up being, I think, somewhere around like 600,000 square foot house, like 700 bedrooms or 700 rooms. I think something like 150 fireplaces, everything made out of marble. I mean, it's unbelievable. I've actually traveled there and seen Versailles, walked through Versailles. It is breathtaking, to say the least. And he's going to end up requiring nobility to spend part of the year living at Versailles with him. So that's another way that he's going to control them, is that he's going to say, hey, if you want to be nobility in this country, you're going to have to come spend 2, 3, 4 months living at Versailles with me. Well, what do you think's happening while the nobles, who are used to being the ones carrying out justice and carrying out policies and doing all this, what do you think's happening while they're at the Palace of Versailles? Well, the attendants have gone into their territory, and now they're implementing things the way they want, that the king wants it done. While the nobility's away, King Louis's attendants will play, right? And that's kind of what he's doing to limit their power. Modern photographs of the Palace of Versailles is what it kind of looks like. You get a sense of the Baroque style that's being used, but you also get to see how it's meant to, to overwhelm the people coming to Versailles. And again, it's pointing to the power of the king. One of the favorite pictures, that I have for sure also is the Hall of Mirrors, which is down here. It's known as the Hall of Mirrors. It's just this huge hall made out of marble, and it's got mirrors all over the place. That's actually where they signed the Treaty of Paris, or the Treaty of Versailles, that ends up ending World War II. They signed it in the Hall of Mirrors. It's a very, very beautiful place, incredibly beautiful. And this is the king's bedroom down here. Funny enough, he actually has a very abnormally large bed for the time. he had it custom made for him, and he goes in, he says, I want a big bed. And they were like, how big do you want it? And he was like, big enough for a king. And so they made a king-sized bed, which is the modern king-sized bed dimensions. And then he says, I need one for my old lady too. Do you want it as big as yours? No, no, no. It just needs to be a little bit smaller. Okay. How much smaller? I don't know. Fit for a queen. And they made a queen-sized bed. And that is literally how king and queen-sized beds came to be, from the dimensions of the king and queen's bed in Versailles. So a little tidbit of information there that's kind of funny. But he also used theater as a means to boost his image, as we said, to cement his power. The other fascinating thing about this particular painting that you see here is that you have all these people standing around. These people are nobles, and they've been invited to come to dinner, not just to eat with the king, but to watch the king and to watch the king eat. Now, chances are, if I showed up, at your lunch table and I just stood there and just watched you, you'd be a little uncomfortable, right? But the whole idea here is that he is controlling and limiting what they're allowed to do. And when he's eating, they have to watch him eat, right? And so when you say absolute control, we mean absolute control. Controlling the nobility and limiting their power, he would require them to spend, again, a portion of the year living at Versailles. The nobles are kind of competing for the favor and attention of the king. It was considered to be a great honor if you were invited to come and watch the king eat. And, he's basically making the nobility dance to his tune. Some of the other things that are not depicted here, but he would have elaborate ceremonies around him getting up and getting dressed in the morning. So if you go back to his bedroom, people would stand out here. So there's this little wall here. He had this wall constructed, and he's back here, and he would have his attendants come and bring his cloak, and then this whole rest of the room, which is like the size of our classroom, would just be filled with nobles. And he'd put his arm in, and they'd be like, oh, he put his arm in so well. Good job, king. Now put your other arm in if it so pleases you. And they would literally watch him, because if you complimented him enough, maybe he'd smile at you and give you $1 million. Literally. It was all built around you only got what you got because you were nice to the king. It was incredible. He was rewarding nobles that are loyal to him. Personal contact with him was given if they were, really good. While they're at Versailles, they're competing for these kinds of favors. They're not off somewhere plotting to get rid of him. They're enthralled with trying to be his best friend. And this is another way that he's going to decrease their power. Now, as the story goes, at one point, Louis is having dinner, and the nobles are around watching him. And he turns to one of the nobles, and he says, hey, your wife, she's about to have a baby, right? And the noble turns to him and says, yes, sir, she's going to have a baby. And he says, well, when is she due? And the noble's like, how can I compliment the king in this response? And he says, whenever your majesty wishes it. When's she going to have that baby? When you say she can. I mean, come on, get real. So again, very clearly, he's an absolutist. Those are political and cultural power, but King Louis XIV also has a great deal of power over the economy. The French economy is based on mercantilism. It's the idea that the government regulates and promotes commerce to achieve a favorable balance of trade. So the government is going to be issuing economic directives to promote commerce, to promote trade, and what they want is a favorable balance of trade. This means that they're going to be exporting more than they import. So they're going to be getting money from their exports that's going to be greater than the money they're paying to bring things in. And this is going to help in keeping them with a large quantity of gold and silver in the treasury. Now, in order for mercantilism to really be effective, it helps if the government has colonies. Because one of the ways that you can have more exports but fewer imports is that the mother country is going to export manufactured goods to the colonies. And they're going to be pumping out a bunch of exports, with the colonies having to buy those exports and then return to the mother country what is a bunch of raw materials. But those don't really count as imports because they're coming from your country. So you basically get the raw materials for super cheap and then sell the exports at high prices because you tell the colonies, we're the only people you can buy from, right? So we're the only people you can sell to, so we can buy it for cheap. We're the only people you can buy from, and you have to buy it for very expensive prices. That makes me rich, right? And so obviously you need fur, lumber, food, gold, silver, and these colonies are going to basically pay for all those manufactured goods. And we can see that the mercantilism, that the economy is heavily regulated by the government, and once again, trying to expand Louis's power by controlling the economy. Now we can explore Louis's effect on religion. So how did he implement absolutism when it comes to the issue of religion? Well, Louis's major goal was to have one king, one law, one faith. And so he saw that everybody following the same religion would protect his royal power, because the way that the people would go to church, the king could be he could encourage the church to say, hey, support the king. So what Louis does in terms of religious power is he appoints church officials. So within the Catholic Church, he's the one that's going to be appointing bishops and archbishops and some of these major positions within the church. But he also, to achieve this idea of one faith, decides to repeal the Edict of Nantes. And if you remember what the Edict of Nantes was, that was passed after the French Wars of Religion to grant religious toleration to French Protestants, known as the Huguenots, right? And that was done by his father, Henry of Navarre, who became Louis XIII, okay? But remember, Louis XIII converted to Catholicism in name only. Louis was raised Catholic completely. He is truly Catholic, and he's going to repeal that religious toleration. Okay, and this is a page of a pamphlet that's printed with the king's edict, and it is to suppress the Edict of Nantes, and to repeal it, and to repeal the privileges that had been granted to the Huguenots. So what the edict, it's called the Edict of Fontainebleau, which you might want to remember, but so what that edict does is it basically closes down the Protestant churches and the Protestant schools in France. Now, technically, you can still continue to be Protestant. He doesn't say you can't be Protestant. He just says you can't go to church or any school that teaches Protestantism. It's the idea, you can be Protestant in your mind, but you can't go to church or have a Protestant service. You can't send your kids to Protestant school. They're learning everything, and so the result of this is that a lot of those French Protestants, the Huguenots, decide to pack up and leave France. Estimates kind of vary widely as to how many. Conservative estimates put it around 250,000 Huguenots leave France. Some higher estimates might even say close to 900,000 French Protestants flee France after this, because they have seen what happens when Catholics try to clamp down on Protestantism in the past. And if y'all remember, it's usually pretty nasty. It usually doesn't go that well for either group in the end. And now France is more or less Catholic. And the king does achieve his goal of one faith with the Edict of Fontainebleau. It does come with negative consequences for France, however, because many of the Huguenots are quite skilled craftspeople. So when they leave, this kind of hurts some of the French industries like silk making and some of the other industries that those French Protestants have been heavily a part of. When the French Protestants leave, they seek the ability to settle in other parts of Europe. So there's actually places like Denmark and Prussia that are actively, trying to get them to come and settle in those areas, because they know that they're going to bring with them all the skills and the crafts, and they're going to help their own economies. So the Protestants are going to go to places like Denmark and Prussia. They go to England. They're even coming to the United States. And you'll see some of them end up in Louisiana, right? They go over to French Canada first, and then they make their way down to Louisiana and settle there. And it's because of the king, showing his absolutism by controlling the Catholic Church in France and controlling the religion by saying, if you're a Protestant, you can't practice your religion. Now that we've looked at how Louis built his absolute powers in politics and culture and the economy and in religion, what's the significance? Well, if we're going to analyze, we can see that there are several significant accomplishments that occurred during the 72 years that he sits on the throne. One of those is that Louis is able to achieve domestic peace in France for the first time in 100 years. In all those lessons about France before, they were torn apart from religious wars. Louis comes into power. He's able to bring peace to that situation. And for the first part of that reign, at least, you see that peace is going to continue between the Protestants and Catholics. Later on, like we said, he issues the Edict of Fontainebleau. It makes the Protestant population leave. But he's going to really cut down on the potential for any kind of religious violence to come up. Louis is also taking powers away from the nobility, and that's going to play into this idea of domestic peace. Early on in Louis's reign, there's a little bit of instability. There's a couple of revolts that take place, but once we get to 1661, Louis is in power and says, I'm not going to have a minister anymore. There really aren't any more major threats to overthrow him. So he reduces their power by having them come to Versailles and compete for his favor, reducing the power of the nobility and the use of intendants to take over functions that the nobility used to do. Again, all of this is contributing to decreasing their power and increasing the power of Louis. He also creates the system of professional judges. He professionalizes the army. He creates government bureaucracy with things like the intendant system. He does a little bit with the Navy, but when it comes to, the French Navy is really going to lag behind the English Navy for sure. When it comes to land power and military might, though, the French army is considered to be really the most powerful in the early modern period. And again, professionalizing these things is going to help enhance his absolutist power. And here at the last slide, there's several positive aspects that come out of Louis' building an absolute monarchy in France. There's still some problems associated with it that are going to cause issues for France down the road further. One of the things that we can see that causes problems with the nobles is that they are exempt from taxation. So Louis is reducing the power of the nobility, but he needs to make sure that he doesn't go so far that they turn on him. And so he does make the nobles exempt from having to pay land taxes or any kind, and that kind of buys him a lot of goodwill. But of course, down the road, this is going to cause difficulties for future monarchs because they're losing on a valuable source of tax revenue. Another issue we see is the decay of the Estates General. Louis refuses to call a meeting of the Estates General during the entirety of his reign, the 72 years, because he's not calling a meeting of this institutional body. People are forgetting how to assist the king and helping him rule. Now, Louis is fine with that. He doesn't need to, but because he's a really good king. But what happens if you have a bad king and they do need help? Nobody knows how to do that. When he dies, his successor, Louis XV, is his 5-year-old, it's actually his grandson. He actually outlives all of his sons. He lived for a long time, if you think about it. He was 5. He sat on the throne for 72 years. He was 77 years old. That's very old for that time frame. He outlived all of his sons, so his grandson is actually going to take over. And he is not going to have the same capabilities as a ruler. And he's going to have major problems once we get into the 1780s, 1790s, and the French Revolution, which we will get to eventually. And that's going to wrap up our first lecture.